I shared my bread with a hungry old worman. Then I met my fiancée's reclusive billionaire mother. I had one shot to make the right impression. Tonight I was finally meeting my fiancée's reclusive billionaire mother, a woman whose name could open doors most people never even knew existed. My hands were sweating, my heart pounding. But on the way from the station I saw an elderly woman sitting alone on a cold park bench. Her hands shaking, her eyes locked on the ground as if the world had forgotten her. I couldn't just walk past. I sat down, broke my bread in half, placed it in her hands and wrapped my jacket around her frail shoulders. She looked at me for a long moment as if weighing something only she understood, and nodded. I didn't know it yet, but that choice would change everything. Because when I stepped into the Whitmore Estate's grand dining room an hour later, she was there at the head of the table and every single pair of eyes was watching me. It was one of those crisp September afternoons, when the sky felt too open and the air carried a sharpness that made every breath feel deeper. I had just stepped off the train in Ashford, Connecticut, my hands tucked in the pockets of my jacket, trying to slow my heartbeat. Tonight was the night I would meet Claire's family, the Whitmores, for the first time. More importantly, I would meet her mother, Margaret Whitmore, the woman everyone seemed to talk about, but almost no one actually saw. Claire described her as private, selective with the people she let into her world. That alone was enough to make my chest feel tight. I decided to walk the mile from the station to their home instead of calling a cab. I told myself it was to enjoy the fresh air, but really I needed the time to rehearse. The path wound through Ashford's historic district, where the brick sidewalks were uneven and the maple trees were just starting to turn. Halfway through, I cut across a small park to save time. It was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. That's when I saw her. She was sitting alone on a weathered stone bench near an old church. Her shoulders hunched, a thin floral blouse hanging loose on her frame. Her hands were clasped together in her lap, but they trembled slightly. Even from a few steps away, I could see the shadows under her eyes and the pallor of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. I slowed my pace without realizing it. As I passed, she looked up at me and her lips parted like she was about to speak but hesitated. I took another 2 steps before I stopped and turned back. "Are you all right?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. She gave a small, almost embarrassed smile and said she hadn't eaten since morning. There was no accusation in her tone, just a simple statement like she was talking about the weather. I had a sandwich in a paper bag still warm from the corner deli. Without thinking too much, I sat down beside her and handed it over. "Here, it's fresh." She looked at the bag, then at me as if weighing something in her mind. "Thank you," she said, and her fingers brushed mine when she took it. Her skin was cold. Up close, I noticed her hair was neatly brushed despite everything else. There was a faint scent of lavender clinging to her, out of place against the worn fabric of her clothes. She unwrapped the sandwich slowly, as if savoring the moment before the first bite. While she ate, I slipped off my jacket. The evening chill was creeping in, and she clearly didn't have anything more than that thin blouse. "You should take this," I said, placing it gently over her shoulders before she could refuse. Her eyes met mine then, and something about the way she looked at me made my stomach tighten. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though that was there. It was sharper, almost like recognition. She didn't ask my name, and I didn't offer it. Instead, she held the sandwich with both hands and said in a soft voice, "We'll see each other again." I gave a small nod, unsure how to respond, then glanced at my watch. I was cutting it close, and the last thing I wanted was to arrive late for dinner. I stood, she adjusted the jacket around her like it was something precious, and I turned toward the street. As I walked away, I caught sight of a sleek black sedan pulling up to the curb near the church. A man in a dark suit stepped out and opened the rear door, but she waved him off without a word. I didn't look back again until I reached the corner, but by then she was gone. The rest of the walk to the Whitmore estate was a blur. My mind kept circling back to her face, the weight in her voice, and that strange certainty when she said we'd meet again. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just one of those moments you have in life. A brief crossing of paths that would fade into memory. But even as I stepped through the iron gates and saw the sprawling house ahead, I couldn't quite let it go. Something about her stayed with me, like the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. By the time I reached the front steps of the Whitmore estate, the late afternoon sun was already casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The house rose before me in sharp lines of pale stone and dark slate, the kind of place that seemed to speak before anyone inside even opened their mouth. A pair of brass lanterns flanked the massive front door, their glass polished to a shine. My palms felt damp against the handle of my overnight bag as I pressed the doorbell. Claire opened it with a smile that steadied me. She looked effortless in a soft cream sweater and jeans, her hair falling in loose waves around her face. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. The foyer was as grand as I imagined, a sweep of marble under a crystal chandelier, a curved staircase rising like something out of an old film. I caught the faint scent of polished wood and lilies. She took my hand, her fingers warm, and led me toward the living room. I had read enough about the Whitmores to know the name carried weight. Margaret Whitmore had started Whitmore Real Estate Group 30 years ago, transforming a local brokerage into one of the largest real estate firms in the Northeast. She built it on deals no one else could close and a refusal to be outworked. Even from a distance, her reputation was sharp and precise, much like the woman herself. Margaret was seated in an armchair near the fireplace, a glass of sparkling water on the side table. She was in her early 60s, her silver hair swept back neatly, a tailored navy dress that looked as if it had been made for her alone. Her eyes, a cool steel blue, assessed me before her smile appeared. "Ethan," she said, her voice calm but edged with authority. "Welcome." I shook her hand and felt the strength in her grip. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Whitmore." She gestured toward the sofa, and I sat my shoulders straight without meaning to. Claire perched beside me, her hand brushing my knee in a small grounding gesture. It did not take long for Victoria to enter. At 37, she carried herself like someone who had never been told no. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek twist, and her tailored black suit fit like armor. Behind her was Greg Reynolds, her husband, tall and composed in a charcoal suit, his lawyer's gaze taking in every detail. Victoria's smile was polite, but I felt the calculation in it. "Claire tells us you work in design," she said. "Freelance must be flexible." I returned the smile. "It has its challenges, but I enjoy the independence." Greg nodded slightly, as if filing the answer away. There was no open hostility in the room, but something under the surface moved like a current. I had felt it before in boardrooms where people pretended to be on the same side. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have hosted a small wedding. Margaret sat at the head of the table, Victoria to her right, Greg beside her. Claire and I were on the left. The conversation stayed on safe topics for a while: the weather, a recent charity gala, a new development project in Boston. But the moment Victoria mentioned an upcoming board meeting, the air shifted. "We will be discussing long-term strategy," she said, glancing at Margaret. "It is important we have leadership in place that understands the scale of what we are handling." Claire's fork paused mid-air. "I am not interested in running the company," she said, her tone even. Victoria's smile did not waver. No, but you are still on the board. Greg set down his wine glass. And that comes with influence. Influence you may not want, but still hold. Margaret's eyes flicked between them. The tension was subtle but unmistakable. I realized then that the story Claire had told me about her family was more than just a difference in lifestyle. Victoria and Greg clearly saw her as an obstacle, not just a sister. Later, when the plates were cleared and dessert was served, Margaret turned her attention to me. Claire mentioned you have been together for 2 years. Marriage is not something I take lightly. Her gaze was steady, but there was a trace of something else there, something protective. I know what it is to choose poorly, she added almost as an afterthought. I had heard only hints of her past, a marriage to a man who saw her success as a resource to exploit, who left her with 2 daughters and a determination never to let them make the same mistake. It explained the precision with which she weighed every word, every move. I met her eyes. I care about Claire more than anything. My work, my life, everything I do is better with her in it. Margaret studied me for a long moment before nodding once. Claire's hand found mine under the table and gave it a squeeze. When the evening wound down, Victoria and Greg excused themselves with polite smiles that felt like sealed envelopes hiding their contents. Margaret walked us to the foyer, her heels clicking softly on the marble. As Claire helped me with my coat, Margaret rested her hand briefly on my arm. Families are complicated, she said quietly. Remember that. Outside, the night air was cool against my face. Claire slipped her arm through mine as we walked toward my car. Neither of us spoke until we reached it. You handled that well, she said finally. I am not sure what I handled, I replied, starting the engine, but I had a feeling I was already part of something larger than I understood. The wrought iron gates loomed ahead, their black bars curling into ornate patterns against the pale winter sky. As I slowed to a stop, a uniformed security guard stepped out from a small brick booth, his posture crisp, his eyes sharp. He motioned for me to lower my window, and I did, the cold air cutting into the warmth of the car. Name, he said, his tone polite but firm. Ethan Carter. I'm here to see Ms. Claire Whitmore. He glanced at a clipboard, then asked for my ID. The way his gaze lingered on the card made me straighten in my seat. After a brief call on his radio, he returned it, gave a short nod, and pressed a button. The gates swung open with a slow, mechanical hum. Driving up the long gravel path, I felt the quiet weight of the estate settle over me. The lawn stretched wide on both sides, edged with leafless maples and manicured hedges. The main house came into view, its stone facade glowing faintly in the late afternoon light. Tall windows reflecting the gray sky. I parked where instructed, the tires crunching softly against the stones. The door opened before I reached it. Helen Brooks met me at the entrance. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a charcoal skirt suit, her graying hair neatly pinned. Her expression was warm but measured, the kind of welcome that came with years of service in a household like this. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice even. Ms. Claire mentioned you would be arriving. Please come in. The foyer smelled faintly of beeswax and fresh flowers. My shoes echoed against the polished marble as Helen led me across the expanse. Along one wall, a series of oil paintings caught my eye. Portraits of people who must have been Whitmores from generations past, their eyes following me in that way. Old portraits sometimes do. As we moved toward a long corridor, she asked how my drive had been. I gave a polite smile and told her it was smooth, omitting any mention of the small roadside park I had stopped at earlier to gather my thoughts. There was something about the quiet of that place I wanted to keep to myself for now. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, its cream walls broken by gilded frames and glass cases displaying sculptures and vases. A runner carpet muffled our steps. Helen spoke occasionally, pointing out a rare landscape by an American painter I vaguely recognized, a gift from a European business partner decades ago. Her tone was soft, almost reverent, as if each piece carried a fragment of the family's story. At the end of the corridor, the air felt warmer, infused with the scent of burning wood. Helen stopped just outside a wide archway and inclined her head. "They are in the drawing room." She stepped aside, letting me enter first. The room was a careful blend of comfort and formality. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a golden glow on the cream-colored walls. Tall bookshelves framed the far side, their shelves lined with hardcovers in rich, dark bindings. Victoria sat near the fire, one leg crossed over the other, holding a glass of white wine. Her black dress was simple yet precise, the sort of clothing that made it clear she knew exactly how she wanted to be seen. Greg was beside her, standing as he spoke to a man in a tailored gray suit, his hands moving in deliberate gestures. Their voices dropped the moment I stepped in. Victoria's eyes swept over me quickly, the way someone might glance at an unfamiliar painting before deciding whether it belonged in the collection. Greg's expression was more neutral, but I could sense the assessment behind it. The man in the gray suit excused himself and slipped out a side door. Victoria stood, her smile practiced. "Ethan, welcome." She moved forward, her heels barely making a sound on the thick rug. Greg followed, extending his hand with a firm grip. "We were just discussing the upcoming benefit dinner," Victoria said, her tone light. "It's quite the event for the firm and for Mother." I nodded politely, unsure if she expected me to comment. The silence stretched for a beat too long, and Greg filled it. "Have you attended one of these gatherings before?" I admitted I hadn't, adding that I was looking forward to seeing it. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Claire appeared from a side hallway, her presence easing the tightness in my chest. She came straight to me, her hand brushing my arm as she greeted her sister and brother-in-law, with a warmth that was genuine, though their responses were cool. "There's coffee in the sitting area," Claire said, guiding me toward a cluster of chairs near the window. Outside, the fading daylight caught on the edges of the fountain in the courtyard, making the water shimmer like gliss. We spoke about small things, travel, the weather, until Margaret's voice carried in from the hall. A moment later, she entered, her pace unhurried but commanding. The conversation shifted immediately, and I found myself once again reminded that everything in this house operated according to an order I was only beginning to understand. Margaret stepped fully into the room, her presence pulling every glance toward her. She was wearing the same deep navy coat I had seen at the park, only now the top buttons were fastened neatly, the fabric still carrying the faint sheen of quality that came with age and care. My breath caught for half a second. There was no mistaking her. She had been the solitary figure on that bench, feeding the sparrows in the cold. And now here she was, walking with the quiet authority of someone who had long been the center of every room she entered. Her eyes swept across the group with measured attention until they landed on me. For a moment they held steady, longer than polite introduction required. It was not an unfriendly look, but it was deliberate, as if she were sorting through a memory she had not expected to use. I held her gaze, unsure if I should speak first. She gave the faintest nod before turning to acknowledge Victoria and Greg, who were already exchanging quick, almost imperceptible glances. Helen appeared at her side to take her coat, but Margaret kept it on, resting her gloved hands lightly over the front. That small choice made the air shift, though no one mentioned it. Claire rose to greet her mother, leaning in for a brief embrace that Margaret returned with careful warmth. Then she moved toward the empty armchair near the fireplace, lowering herself with the grace of someone who did not rush for anyone. I stayed quiet, watching the subtle choreography unfold. Victoria leaned slightly toward Greg, her voice too low for me to catch. He gave the smallest shrug without taking his eyes off Margaret. It was clear they were both wondering the same thing. Why had she paused on me, and what did it mean? Margaret rested her hands on the arms of the chair and looked around the room. "I am glad to see everyone here," she said evenly. Her tone soft but steady enough to cut through the low crackle of the fire. Her eyes flickered over me again, and I had to force myself to look at the patterned rug instead of trying to read her expression. Claire offered coffee, which Margaret accepted with a polite nod. Helen returned with a silver tray, the cups and saucers barely rattling as she set them down. Margaret accepted hers without breaking eye contact with Claire. The conversation restarted in small pieces, talk of the benefit dinner and recent travel. But there was an edge to it now, as if each sentence was weighed for what it might reveal. When Victoria turned to me, it was with a polite smile that did not soften her eyes. "Ethan, you said this was your first visit here, correct?" I confirmed it, careful to keep my voice level. Margaret took a slow sip from her cup, listening. Claire added that I had arrived just in time to see the gardens before winter took the last of the color. Greg asked if I had been given the full tour yet. "Not yet," I replied, and Helen offered to arrange one before the evening. The warmth from the fire made the room feel smaller, more enclosed. I was aware of every glance, every pause. Margaret set her cup down and rested her chin lightly on one hand. "You were at the park earlier today, were you not?" Her question was direct, but her tone was almost casual. My mind tightened around the memory of her feeding the birds. "Yes," I said slowly. "I like quiet places." Something passed over her face, then a hint of a smile that was gone as quickly as it came. Victoria's eyes sharpened. She looked from her mother to me, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. Greg shifted his weight, leaning back into the sofa. Claire, sensing the change, reached for a fresh pot of coffee and offered refills, breaking the slints. The moment dissolved, but not entirely. Margaret's attention had lingered too long for anyone to dismiss it. Helen reappeared to ask if we would like to move to the dining room for the first course. Margaret agreed, standing with the same deliberate composure she had when she entered. As we began to file out, I felt her glance at me once more. It was not accusatory, but it carried the weight of someone who had already drawn a conclusion. I followed the others toward the dining room, the soft echo of footsteps in the corridor mingling with the low murmur of voices ahead. The dining room opened before us in warm amber light, the long mahogany table already set with polished silver and crystal that caught the glow of the chandelier. Helen guided us to our places, her quiet efficiency leaving no sound but the soft rustle of chairs and the muted clink of glass. I took my seat across from Claire, with Greg on one side and Victoria on the other. Margaret was at the head of the table, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the carved arms of her chair. The first course was served, a delicate salad arranged with precision on fine porcelain. Conversation started in polite, almost rehearsed tones, touching on the vineyard's latest release and an upcoming charity auction. I let my eyes wander to the tall windows behind Margaret, where the night pressed against the glass and the reflection of the chandelier hovered like a crown above her head. When the plates were cleared, Margaret placed her napkin neatly beside her plate and rose. The subtle shift in the room was immediate. Forks paused, chairs stilled, even Helen halted mid-step with the wine bottle in hand. Margaret's voice, calm and steady, carried easily down the length of the table. "There is something I would like to share," she began, her gaze moving from one face to another. "A few months ago, I decided I needed to understand a person in a way no formal introduction could provide." She let the words settle before continuing. "So I went out on my own in plain clothes to see how a potential member of this family treated those who have nothing to offer in return." My chest tightened. I didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes passed over me but didn't linger, as if what she was saying belonged to the whole table. She spoke of sitting in a park alone, of testing whether kindness extended beyond social obligation. She did not say my name nor describe me directly, but I could feel the weight of her memory in each word. She spoke of a man who had offered help without hesitation, whose tone had no trace of pity or performance. She said nothing of titles or background, only that character and compassion were in her mind the highest measures of worth. Greg shifted in his seat, his smile fixed but his eyes sharp. "That is admirable," he said smoothly, "but sometimes appearances can be misleading. A person can seem generous in a moment and still be quite different when the setting changes." Margaret's lips curved into the faintest smile. "That is always possible," she replied, her tone light but immovable, "which is why one must look not at what is displayed but at what is repeated." The air in the room thickened, though no one spoke. She let the silence stretch for a beat longer, then turned slightly toward me. "Ethan, would you mind joining me here?" She gestured to the empty chair at her right. For a moment no one moved. I rose, aware of Victoria's glance flicking toward Greg, and made my way down the length of the table. Helen stepped forward quickly, sliding the chair back for me. Margaret waited until I was seated before she adjusted the placement of her own chair, nudging Victoria's slightly farther down the table. She did the same to Greg's on the other side, her movements deliberate, but without explanation. Once I was settled, Margaret resumed, speaking to the group about the family's legacy, about responsibility as a form of stewardship rather than possession. Her hand rested briefly on the table near mine, not touching but close enough to feel intentional. I focused on the soft grain of the wood, aware of every pair of eyes on me, and wondered just how much she intended to reveal and how much she planned to keep to herself. Margaret lifted her wine glass and took a measured sip, her eyes drifting to Greg as if inviting him to speak. He leaned back slightly, the corners of his mouth pulling into what might have been a polite smile if not for the glint behind his eyes. "So, Ethan," he began, his tone casual but the cadence slow, "what exactly is it you do for work these days?" I took a moment, keeping my breathing steady. "I work for a non-profit focused on community development. My role is managing program budgets, ensuring funds are allocated to the right projects." Greg nodded, his fingers tapping the stem of his glass. "And by budgets, what scale are we talking about? Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, around 2.5 million annually?" I said, my voice even. "We have several ongoing initiatives across the state, including youth mentorship and food distribution networks." His brows rose slightly, though his smile stayed fixed. "That is more than I expected. And compensation, nonprofits are not exactly known for competitive salaries." Before I could respond, Victoria's voice cut in, sweet but edged. "Which makes me wonder how you plan to keep up with Claire's lifestyle. She has always been accustomed to certain standards, you know." I looked at her briefly, then back to Greg. "I live comfortably within my means. I value stability more than flash. My focus has always been on making an impact." Victoria let out a soft laugh, glancing at Claire as if sharing a private joke. "That is admirable, but marriage is about shared expectations. If one person is constantly adjusting downward, it can create friction." Margaret's gaze flicked toward her daughter, but she did not speak. Greg leaned forward slightly, the low light catching in his cufflinks. "So, Ethan, long-term, do you plan to stay in the nonprofit world, or is this a stepping stone to something more lucrative?" I set my fork down, folding my hands lightly. "I plan to stay. I believe in the mission, and I see tangible results from the work. I am not chasing a windfall." Greg's jaw tightened, barely noticeable, and he glanced at Victoria before turning back to me. "And your savings investments?" Claire shifted in her seat, ready to say something, but I spoke first. I have a balanced portfolio, modest but steady growth. I am debt-free. The table was quiet for a moment, the clink of silverware from the far end filling the space. Then Helen, who had been silent until now, spoke up. I have actually seen Ethan at work. All eyes turned to her. It was last winter, she continued, during that big storm. The community center was short on staff, and I saw him directing volunteers, making sure boxes of food got to families before the roads iced over. He was out there in the cold for hours. Greg's expression faltered for the first time, a flicker of something unguarded crossing his face. That must have been challenging, he said, his voice thinner than before. It was, I said simply, but worth it. Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes steady on me. The conversation drifted then, but the undercurrent remained. Every question that followed felt like it had a hidden hook, and every answer I gave was weighed in the silent space between us. I could feel the shift in the air, subtle but real, as if the balance at the table was beginning to tilt. As the conversation around the table shifted to lighter topics, I excused myself under the pretense of refilling my water. In the quieter corner near the sideboard, Helen was adjusting her shawl, her eyes following the others with a careful detachment. When I stepped closer, she gave me a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. You handle yourself well in there, she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. Then her tone lowered even more. But be mindful. There are things moving behind the scenes that you might not see yet. I studied her face, the fine lines around her mouth tightening as if she were choosing her words with care. What kind of things? She hesitated, her gaze drifting toward Margaret at the far end of the table. Greg has been urging her to make changes to the trust, and not small changes either. He wants her to sign a new version and a power of attorney. The timing and the way he is pressing, it is not right. A dull weight settled in my chest when soon she said, He has been arranging meetings always when most of the family is not around. He says it is for efficiency. I have been through enough in my own family to recognize the signs when someone is steering an elderly relative into something without them fully realizing it. I kept my voice even though my pulse had quickened. Does Margaret seem aware of what he is pushing for? Helen's lips pressed together. She trusts him maybe too much. And that is why I am telling you. You have a steadier influence on Claire than anyone. If she knows, maybe she can speak with her mother before anything is signed. I thanked her quietly and returned to my seat, my mind racing as the rest of dinner passed in a blur. Claire noticed my distraction, her hand brushing mine under the table. Later, as we slipped our coats on in the foyer, she asked in a low voice what Helen had said. Out on the porch, with the cold air clearing my head, I told her everything. The trust, the power of attorney, Greg's pressure. Her brows knitted together. That is not just family drama. If Helen is right, this could be legal trouble. I nodded, which is why we need someone who knows exactly how this works. Someone who has seen this before. Claire leaned against the porch railing, her breath curling in the air. Mark Davis. My aunt used him last year when there was a dispute over my grandfather's estate. He is in his early 50s, sharp, specializes in elder law. If there is something wrong here, he will spot it. The decision felt immediate and necessary. I told her I would reach out first thing in the morning. The next day, I called Mark's office from my truck during my lunch break. His assistant put me through after a brief hold, and within minutes I was explaining Helen's concerns, careful to stick to what I knew and not what I feared. Mark's voice was calm but focused. If Greg is arranging for changes to a trust and a power of attorney, and if Margaret is elderly and potentially under his influence, that raises red flags. especially if the meetings are being scheduled without all relevant parties informed. What can we do? I asked. For now, he said, I want you to keep your ears open. If you can get exact dates or documents, even better. Do not confront Greg directly yet. That can spook him or make him double down. I will do some quiet checking on my end, see if any filings or drafts have been prepared. I agreed, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. Before we ended the call, Mark added, I have seen cases like this escalate quickly. Timing matters. Stay close to Claire's mother if you can, and keep me posted on any shifts in the family dynamic. When I hung up, I sat for a long moment in the driver's seat, staring out at the parking lot, the hum of passing traffic in my ears. Something told me the dinner last night had been more than just an awkward family gathering. It had been a stage, and Greg had been testing how far he could push before anyone pushed back. That night, I told Claire about the call. She listened without interrupting, her jaw set. In that way, I recognized from the rare moments she was truly angry. Then she nodded once decisively. We will keep our eyes open, she said, and we will not let him blindside her. Her certainty steadied me, but I knew we were stepping into something layered and deliberate. The kind of thing that did not unravel all at once, but thread by thread until the whole pattern was exposed. A few days later, Claire's mother called and invited us to the Whitmore Foundation's annual gala. Her tone carried that blend of warmth and formality that made it clear this was not just a social outing. It felt like an unspoken test, the kind where how you carried yourself mattered as much as what you said. Claire accepted without hesitation, and I followed her lead. The gala was held at the Crestwood Hotel, a stately place with marble floors that reflected the soft glow of chandeliers. I wore my best suit, one I had only used for weddings and important meetings, and Claire looked stunning in a dark blue gown that caught the light each time she moved. The air was filled with the faint scent of polished wood and expensive perfume. Guests mingled over champagne, their conversations blending into a low, constant hum. Margaret greeted us near the entrance, a graceful figure in silver, her smile warm but assessing. She introduced me to a few board members, each handshake deliberate, their eyes scanning for cues about who I was and why I was there. I could feel Greg's presence before I saw him, that low, watchful energy cutting through the room. When our eyes met across the crowd, he gave a polite nod and then turned away, already speaking to a cluster of donors. The evening seemed set to unfold smoothly until a young event coordinator rushed over to Margaret, her face pale. Margaret's brows drew together and she pulled her aside. I watched from a short distance until Claire touched my arm and whispered that something was wrong. Moments later, Margaret returned, composed but tight-lipped. The caterer had just backed out, citing a last-minute equipment failure. The reception was supposed to start in under 2 hours. Without food, the entire night could collapse. The room was already filling with guests expecting elegance and precision. Margaret looked from Claire to me as if weighing whether to involve me. I stepped forward before she could decide. I asked for the event coordinator's number and within seconds was scrolling through contacts in my phone. Years in construction had taught me the value of knowing people in every trade, including food service. I called an old friend who ran a farm-to-table bistro downtown and explained the situation quickly but clearly. He hesitated at first, but when I promised the exposure and offered to cover immediate costs, he agreed. He could have a crew here within the hour with enough artisanal platters, fresh bread, and hot dishes to keep guests talking for the right reasons. I relayed the plan to Margaret, who studied me for a long second before nodding. Do it. From there it was a blur. I coordinated with hotel staff to clear kitchen space and arranged for servers from a nearby temp agency to step in. Claire handled the decor adjustments, shifting seating and rearranging floral displays to buy us time and make the changes look intentional. By the time the first trays came out, no one in the main hall had any idea there had been a problem. The food was fresh, beautifully presented, and paired with the hotel's wine selection. Guests commented on how unique the menu was this year, and I saw Margaret's shoulders ease for the first time since the news broke. She even took me aside briefly to thank me, her voice low but sincere. Across the room, I caught Greg watching. He was leaning against the far wall, his drink untouched, eyes following me. The way a chess player studies an opponent's move. There was no open hostility in his expression, just a cool calculation that made me uneasy. It felt less like I had passed a test and more like I had revealed a card he was eager to exploit. Later in the evening, as the speeches began, I took my place beside Claire at one of the round tables near the center. Margaret spoke first, thanking donors and highlighting the foundation's work over the past year. Her voice carried pride and poise, and I noticed how the audience leaned in, truly listening. When the applause settled, the night slipped back into the easy rhythm of music and conversation. Claire excused herself to speak with a friend across the room. I stayed at the table answering polite questions from the couple seated beside me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Greg move through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling just enough to blend in. But every so often his gaze would land on me, assessing, storing away whatever he thought he had learned. By the time the gala wound down, the crisis of the evening felt like a distant memory to most in the room. To me, it felt like something else entirely, a quiet exchange of signals in plain sight. And I had the uneasy sense that while I had helped save the night, I had also stepped deeper into a game I did not yet fully understand. 2 mornings after the gala, I was pouring coffee in the kitchen when my phone buzzed with a text from Sam Carter. It was short, but enough to make my stomach tighten. "We need to talk. Call me." I stepped outside to the small porch and dialed him. He didn't waste time. "Words going around that you used the Whitmore Foundation's gala to promote yourself. They're saying the catering fiasco was staged so you could swoop in and look like a hero." I gripped the railing, staring out at the quiet street. The accusation was absurd, but I knew better than to dismiss it. Lies like that could stick if they reached the right ears. Sam said he'd already heard it from 2 different people, one of them a board member. The source wasn't hard to guess. Greg. Claire came into the doorway, her hair still damp from the shower, holding her own mug. She saw my face and her smile faded. "What happened?" I told her what Sam had said. Her jaw set, eyes flashing with a mix of anger and worry. She knew how quickly a whisper could turn into a narrative, especially in circles where reputation was currency. By mid-morning, Sam showed up at my place with his laptop. He had been digging into ways to counter the story before it gained traction. First step was proving that every dollar spent on that food had been accounted for, documented, and unconnected to any personal gain. We went through the receipts from the bistro, the payment confirmations, the temp agency invoices. Sam suggested we also pull the foundation's publicly available Form 990 to show how expenditures were typically logged. I spent hours cross-referencing the timeline, matching calls, deliveries, and signatures. Each piece formed a clean trail from the moment the caterer canceled to the arrival of the replacement food. There wasn't a single point that could be twisted into personal promotion. In the afternoon, I called Mark, my attorney, and an old friend from my construction days. He listened quietly as I laid out what had happened. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "If Greg is willing to plant something like this, it's not just about embarrassing you. He's testing how quickly you respond, how much support you can rally." Mark said the best approach was to get ahead of it with facts, not emotion. Present the truth calmly, directly, and to the right people. That evening, Claire and I drove to Sam's office downtown. The three of us sat around a long oak table covered in papers, receipts, and a printed copy of the Form 990. Sam had even highlighted the sections that proved transparency and procurement. I felt a surge of gratitude for how quickly he had stepped in, but also a flicker of unease that I even needed to defend myself this way. We decided on a strategy. First, quietly share the documents with Margaret, not as a defense, but as an assurance that everything was handled above board. Second, make sure at least 2 board members saw the same evidence so there was no room for misinterpretation. Third, keep everything in writing to create a record in case this moved into legal territory. When we left the office, the sky was already dark, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement from an earlier rain. Claire slipped her hand into mine as we walked to the car. "You handled the gala perfectly," she said. "Don't let him make you doubt that." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg wasn't improvising. This felt like one step in a longer plan, one that was designed to corner me before I even realized the walls were closing in. Margaret called me late on a Tuesday afternoon and asked me to be at the Whitmore conference room at 9 the next morning. Her tone was measured, but I could feel the weight behind it. When I arrived, the room was already half full. The long mahogany table gleamed under the overhead lights, and the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and leather-bound folders. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. To her right was Mark, already leafing through a thick binder. On her left, Helen sat with her hands folded neatly, eyes lowered. Across from them, Greg lounged in his chair with an almost casual confidence. And beside him was Victoria, her lips pressed into a thin smile. A few seats down, 2 men and a woman I recognized from previous foundation events sat quietly, likely the witnesses Margaret had mentioned in her message. Margaret began without small talk. "We are here to clear the air and address actions that could have serious consequences for this family and for the foundation." She nodded to Mark. He stood, opened the binder, and began to lay out documents one by one. Each page was dated, signed, and in some cases annotated with sticky notes. Mark explained how Greg had initiated steps to alter the trust and reassign the power of attorney, all without following the required review process. Helen spoke next, her voice steady but tinged with unease. She said she had overheard Victoria pressing Greg to push the paperwork through quickly, suggesting that Margaret would be too occupied with foundation matters to notice. Helen's statement hung in the air, and Victoria shifted in her seat, glancing briefly at Greg before leaning forward. "That's a misinterpretation," she said. "We were simply trying to streamline things for everyone's benefit." Greg backed her up, insisting that the changes were merely preparatory and that no harm had been intended, but Margaret did not respond to their defense right away. Instead, she reached into a slim leather folder and produced a USB drive. She signaled to one of the staff to connect it to the wall-mounted screen. The footage appeared grainy at first, but the sound was clear. It was from the small security camera mounted outside the church where the outreach program was held last winter. The scene showed me handing a loaf of bread to a man in a worn coat, then shrugging off my own jacket and placing it around his shoulders. There was no microphone on me, but the voices of others nearby carried the simple exchange. No speeches, no cameras, no mention of the foundation. Just a moment of human kindness. When the clip ended, Margaret spoke softly. "I wanted everyone to see for themselves the kind of man Ethan is without the noise of rumor." Greg's expression tightened and Victoria looked away. Before they could respond, the door at the far end of the room opened. Pastor John Lewis stepped in, his presence quiet yet commanding. Margaret rose to greet him, then invited him to speak. Pastor Lewis said he had known Margaret for years, and that some months back she had confided in him about wanting to test my character before making any long-term decisions regarding the Foundation's leadership. She had asked him to set up opportunities for me to be involved in community work without my knowing I was being observed. The bread and coat moment had been one of those instances. The room was silent for several seconds. Greg looked down at the table, his earlier confidence fraying. Victoria's fingers drummed against her folder, a faint, impatient rhythm. Margaret's gaze swept the table. Transparency matters in this family and in this organization. What has been presented today is serious. We will discuss next steps after reviewing all the evidence thoroughly. I sat back in my chair, my pulse slowing but not settling. This was a win, but it didn't feel final. Greg wasn't the type to back down after a public setback, and I could sense that whatever came next would not be in this room, at least not yet. 2 days later, Margaret called another meeting, this time in her private study. The room was smaller than the conference room, lined with shelves of leather-bound books and the scent of polished wood. The windows let in the pale winter light, casting long shadows over the green carpet. Claire was beside me, her hand warm against mine, and Mark sat near the fireplace with a folder balanced on his knee. Greg and Victoria arrived late, their steps echoing in the quiet. Margaret stood by her desk, papers neatly stacked in front of her. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of finality. After careful review and consultation with legal counsel, I have decided to revoke your co-signing authority over any trust or asset-related decisions. You will also be removed from the board of the Whitmore Foundation and from the Budget Committee, effective immediately. Greg's jaw tightened and Victoria's eyes widened, but Margaret continued without pause. Additionally, I have added protective clauses to ensure that Ethan and Claire are safeguarded from any undue interference or abuse of authority from family members. Victoria's voice cracked as she stepped forward. You can't just cut us out like this, Margaret. This isn't right. Margaret met her gaze without flinching. What is not right is exploiting trust for personal gain. The damage to this family's name and to the Foundation's reputation cannot be overlooked. Greg's face flushed. We've dedicated years to this family's affairs. You think Ethan is better suited just because of a few charitable stunts? My pulse thudded, but I kept my voice steady. It's not about being better suited, it's about being honest and accountable. Margaret shifted the papers toward Mark, who slid them across the desk to Greg and Victoria. These are the formal notices. You'll also find a separate document outlining the legal implications of your actions. Our attorneys will be in touch regarding the next steps. They didn't touch the papers right away. Victoria's glare swept over me, lingering for a beat too long before she turned to Greg. Without a word, they both walked out the door, shutting with a dull thud. The weeks that followed made it clear that Margaret's decision had rippled far beyond the family. Word spread quickly through Riverdale Heights. Invitations to charity galas, exclusive club dinners, and art fundraisers stopped arriving for Greg and Victoria. Their absence at the annual winter ball was noticed by everyone, whispered about in corners over champagne glasses. I would sometimes pass by the country club on my way to the foundation office and catch sight of them sitting alone at a corner table, the easy smiles and clusters of well-dressed friends replaced by silence and lowered eyes. Claire told me she had overheard 2 women at the farmer's market discussing how surprising it was to see Greg and Victoria on the outside looking in. Inside the foundation, the atmosphere shifted. Without Greg's interruptions and Victoria's backdoor lobbying meetings ran smoother. Projects that had been stalled for months moved forward. Margaret began to lean on me more for strategic decisions, and Claire took on a larger role in managing community outreach. One evening, as we walked home through the crisp air, Claire slipped her arm through mine and said she was proud of how I had handled everything. You didn't win this by scheming or playing their game, she said. You just kept doing what was right, and it showed. Her words stayed with me. I had spent months under pressure, anticipating attacks and countering moves, but in the end, it wasn't about outmaneuvering anyone. It was about staying grounded, transparent, and consistent even when the temptation to fight fire with fire was strong. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg wasn't finished. Actions like his rarely came without an aftershock, and part of me kept listening for footsteps behind closed doors. For now, though, Riverdale Heights had shifted, and for the first time in a long while it felt like the balance had tipped towards something that resembled justice. By mid-December, the air in Riverdale Heights carried that sharp winter chill that made every breath feel clean and alive. Our wedding day arrived quietly without the fanfare or the distant echoes of ballroom orchestras. Margaret had insisted we use the garden behind her home, the same place where countless family gatherings had once been held and where the late afternoon sun could still find its way through the bare branches. White chairs lined the path to a small wooden arch, wrapped in evergreen garlands and winter roses. Friends and family sat bundled in coats, their laughter mingling with the faint hum of a portable heater near the patio. Claire stood at the far end of the garden, the ivory of her dress glowing against the muted greens and grays of winter. Margaret approached me before the ceremony began, a gentle smile on her face. Draped over her arm was the same navy coat I had given to the man in the park all those months ago, freshly cleaned but still carrying a trace of its familiar weight. Without a word, she lifted it and settled it across my shoulders. Her eyes held mine for a moment, and I knew what it meant. It was not just a coat anymore. It was trust returned, the quiet seal of acceptance. The ceremony itself was simple. Pastor Lewis spoke warmly, his words steady against the rustle of wind through the trees. Claire's vows were filled with both gratitude and defiance against every doubt we had faced. When it was my turn, I told the story that had begun with a loaf of bread on a park bench, how it had led to the moments that tested not my patience or my pride, but my belief in what mattered most. I looked around the garden and saw faces I trusted now. Faces that had watched me stand through trials without losing my footing. I told them that the hardest tests do not come when the world is watching, but in those quiet moments when no one seems to be. That how we treat the person we believe no one else sees says more about us than wealth or position ever could. Claire's hand tightened in mine as I finished, and the applause that followed felt less like celebration of a union and more like a collective exhale after a long winter. The reception was held under a tent lit with strings of golden bulbs. Instead of a tiered cake, we had tables of warm bread, cheeses, and bowls of winter soup, a nod to where our story began. Margaret made a short toast, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. She spoke of family, of mistakes and lessons, and of finding the courage to see people for who they are, rather than what we assume them to be. As the evening wore on and the air grew colder, I found myself standing at the edge of the garden, watching the lights sway in the breeze. Claire joined me, slipping her arm through mine. We had crossed something vast together, something that had left us both changed in ways that would last longer than any celebration. By the time the last guests had gone and the quiet of night settled over Riverdale Heights, I felt a rare stillness inside me. The disputes, the accusations, the maneuvering, all of it seemed distant now. What remained was the certainty that I had faced the test Margaret had set, and perhaps even the unspoken one I had set for myself. Sometimes the richest outcome is not measured in accounts or property, but in the people who stand beside you when the air grows cold. And sometimes the true victory is walking forward knowing you did not have to become someone else to win. If you had been in my place, would you have passed Margaret's test? And if someone quietly tested you when no one was watching, how would you respond? I would like to hear your thoughts.